1 minute. Thank you all. And if you have questions beforehand, feel free to put them in the Q&A section on here or hashtag #IamThinkTank. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's IAM and Harvard NPLI Think Tank. My name's Rich Serino, currently a Distinguished Senior Fellow at Harvard University's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative and former Deputy Administrator of FEMA. With everything going on today in the world, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us for another Think Tank. Today's Think Tank, we really appreciate you taking the time, especially as we're dealing with this global pandemic that we've been in, and some of us in New York and Boston preparing for a blizzard. And I know one of our guests is in the middle of dealing with that as well. Our last Think Tank we held virtually in Brooklyn with Deanne and the FEMA Administrator, Pete Gaynor. Today, the call will work instead of our typical in-person events. We're obviously holding this one over Zoom. In today's Think Tank call, we're calling Lessons Learned During COVID-19, specifically on how to deal with the Department of Defense, local emergency management, and how do we actually work with the Department of Defense during times of a crisis and emergencies. And I'm pleased today we actually have three fantastic panelists. First is New York City Emergency Management Commissioner Deanne Criswell. Deanne was appointed the Commissioner of New York City Emergency Management in 2019. During that time, she hasn't really had much going on in New York City. She's responsible for the oversight and the planning to prepare for emergencies, educating the public about preparedness, coordinating emergency response and recovery. But prior to joining NICEM, Deanne served as the leader of one of FEMA's National Incident Management Assistance Teams, a national IMAT team, also as a federal coordinating officer. And during this role, Commissioner Criswell was the primary federal representative to responding to many disasters across the country, from flooding in North Dakota to hurricanes in South Carolina and fires in Colorado. I had the pleasure of working with her when I was at FEMA for a while. And before that, she served as the Office of Emergency Management in Aurora, Colorado. Next, we'll be hearing from Major General Bill Hall, retired. He led the response for New York and New Jersey for COVID during this year. General Hall has completed 33 years of service in the Army after leading the COVID response in New York and New Jersey this past spring. Response included responsibility for 3 alternate care sites, alternate care facilities, as ACF as they're known. And we'll talk in depth about that a little later. As well as DOC staff for 13 hospitals, worked with New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner and over 2,800 DOD personnel. He served as the 11th Commanding General of Joint Task Force Civil Support at Fort Eustis, Virginia, responsible for the nation's only standing CBRN Joint Task Force. He's also led warriors every echelon of platoon of the 2nd Army, 2nd Star Command and Armor recruiting in CBRN units during Iraqi freedom. He commanded Tank Battalion, Anbar Province during Operation Enduring Freedom. He commanded Maneuver Enhancement Brigade as the Deputy Chief Strategy in the European Command from 2015 to 2017. And Bill has enabled bases of overflight, the U.S. Central Command, conducting operations in Turkey in support of Operation Inherent Evolved. Bill, General Hall, as I should say, he's done a lot around the world, also helped with the planning of the Super Bowl in Fort Worth in February 2011. And he certified the nation's 3rd Homeland Support Force. So Bill, thank you for joining us today. He's very recently retired, and living in the heart of Texas where he's not dealing with a blizzard today. And then we'll be talking with Colonel Kim Aiello. She was the task force commander in 2020 COVID response for FEMA regions 1, 2, 3, 4. And during this period of time, Colonel Aiello is currently transitioning from the Army after 28 years of service. She served numerous leadership operational assignments in her career, with the most recent being the 44th Medical Brigade out of Fort Bragg. She led a 2,300 person formation during her tenure. She serves as Task Force Medical Commander, where she led 3,000 joint DoD formation that provided care and support to COVID-19. She responds to all the various FEMA regions, including New York, the Javits Center and New York Medical Station, as well as many public hospitals in New York. The conversation is open to everyone. I encourage you to ask questions, engage in the discussion. We'll be taking questions through the Zoom in the Q&A section, and also via Twitter using the hashtag IAEM Think Tank. Deanne, we're going to go to you first. Thanks for joining us today. And any opening remarks to get us going? Deanne?
Thanks, Rich, and really excited to be here with this panel. You know, you mentioned that General Hall, Bill, as I like to say, just recently retired, and I wonder if I pushed him to that through our cooperation here in New York City for COVID. I hope not, Bill. But, you know, let me just start by setting the stage a little bit of what happened here in New York City, so it'll help drive, I think, the conversation a little bit. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of facts and some dates. And so March 1st of this year is when we had our first confirmed case. And then just a little bit over 30 days later, by April 9th, we had our peak single day of positive cases, which was 7,521. So this incident grew very rapidly over the month of March. Since we're going to talk a lot about the support with our military professionals, I really wanted to talk about some other key facts too that really played into that. So our peak single day hospital admissions that we experienced here was actually on March 29th, so less than a month from our very first just positive case. And that was 1,140 case admissions in a single day. The peak number of patients that we had on ventilators was 2,713 on a single day, not new ones, but consensus or census on a single day. And then the peak ICU patients that were not on a ventilator were actually only 459. So you can see the majority of our patients that we had were really sick. And then the peak non-ICU census was 8,829. So this grew really fast over the month of March. We also had at a peak, our EMS calls in a single day were just over 6,500 EMS calls in one day, which was more than twice our normal call volume. And we also brought in 350 ambulances through FEMA's National Ambulance Contract. And they came from 21 states and responded to over 29,000 EMS calls during their time here. And during the worst 3 weeks of the pandemic, and for us, remember our first case was on March 1st. Our worst 3 weeks was March 22nd to April 11th. And we averaged 33,000 new cases a week and 2,500 deaths per week over that 3-week time frame. And so you can see where things were really growing really fast. And then on top of all that, we had to provide staffing to support this and personal protective equipment, both which were in short order. And we're going to talk a little bit about the staffing, but I want to talk a little bit about PPE too. Our logistics team was just phenomenal, and they sourced over 2,100 resource requests that really allotted to more than 7,500 unique items and over 2.2 million pieces, individual pieces of PPE throughout March and into June. And so just the logistics challenge alone for this was just astronomical. So when we get to then talking about supporting or working with our federal partners and our state partners in order to manage something that was growing so rapidly, I really like to go back to slogan or mantra that FEMA has been stating a lot lately, which is federally supported and state managed and locally executed. And I think some of the numbers that I talked about here really set the stage for how this really was locally executed. But we couldn't have done it without the support of our state and federal partners. And what's interesting in what I want to talk about is that everybody was making planning assumptions on how they were going to support as this was growing. And it was growing so fast and refining really fast that the planning assumptions that were made on March 1st certainly weren't the planning assumptions that we needed at the peak when we get into the end of March. And so I think it's really important to note that as if we are really going to look at this federally supported, state managed, locally executed concept, then it's really important as federally supported and state managed as they're developing planning assumptions that you get to know what the requirements actually are on the ground so the locals can execute. And we worked through that together as a team and we had a great team, but it's a really important piece that if you don't have that relationship and you can't navigate those relationships with your state and federal partners, you're not going to be able to refine that planning assumption as you go. And so I think the last thing that I'll say just to kind of start this off is that those relationships then really do make a difference, right? I think that you need to leverage your existing relationships to start getting resources moving. And I was fortunate, right? I was fortunate that I did have a federal background as well as some time with the military and the Air National Guard. And so I understood the type of resources that were available. And so I leveraged those existing relationships that I had so we could start getting resources moving because this was just growing exponentially day by day. But at the same time, I was developing new relationships. I didn't know Bill and I didn't know Colonel Aiello during the beginning of this, but we became really close during this process. And it took ongoing communication amongst the three of us, as well as their support teams, to really understand how our needs were progressing as well as stabilizing and how their needs were also changing as now we were starting to see rises across the country. And so developing those new relationships as you're going through a crisis, especially one that's novel and nobody has gone through, is equally as important as having those relationships to begin with, because you're going to fine tune what those requirements are throughout that process so you can finally get to a solution that meets everybody's needs. And then I think the last thing that I'll say just to start this out is you have to then maintain that consistent communication. You know, the three of us met daily for a while, then it turned into a couple times a week and then weekly. And then we really did some targeted communication with our hospitals that they were supporting. And one of the numbers that I didn't really put out there was that at the peak, we really brought in, I think it was over 800 military medical personnel that were supporting our 11 public hospitals directly. And it was at a time that was really, it couldn't have come any sooner, right? Really, it came almost at the last possible moment when we were really looking at our staffing day by day to see if we had enough staff to get through the next 72 hours. And I'll close with, as we were saying goodbye to one of the last teams that was leaving Elmhurst Hospital, my favorite quote from this entire incident was one of the nurses came up to us and said to the military that were leaving that you were our miracle when we needed a miracle most. Thank you for being our miracle. And if it weren't for the ability for us to have these open and sometimes quite frank conversations about what was needed, then we wouldn't have been able to provide the support to my customers, which was health and hospitals and the other hospitals in the New York City area, and make sure that we were having the right resources to save lives.
Oh, great. Thank you, Commissioner. And a couple of questions. You know, you hear from local emergency managers who perhaps haven't worked with DOD in the past. They're just used to working with FEMA. You had the experience of being at FEMA and also being in the military in the past. What would you say to emergency managers who, you know, haven't had the opportunity to work with DOD, but they are now? What would be some of the things you'd suggest to them that if all of a sudden, boom, you know, we have General Hall and Colonel Aiello knocking it out of the door?
Yeah, I think that the biggest piece on that is making sure that, I mean, if you I mean, we can take this in a couple places, Rich. I think before an incident happens, as much as you can try to build those relationships through your FEMA regional offices, through the defense coordinating officer and their staff, as well as through your National Guard liaisons and National Guard members that are in your region, your state, or your local community, is really important. Because if you train and exercise with them on the things that they're working on, as well as invite them into your own exercises, you'll start to understand what the capabilities are, and they'll understand what your capabilities or your shortfalls are. And so I think as much as you can do to include them in daily planning makes a big difference. And even if it's just in a small scale, just to start to have those conversations. But as you're going through an event like this, I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're being very clear on what your requirements are. And if somebody comes in with a planning assumption that isn't meeting your needs of how you have to execute on the ground and close the gaps that you have, then you have to figure out a way to communicate that and explain it in a way that can help drive the response. I know we talk a lot about when people put in mission assignments or we have prescriptive mission requests that we give to the state. We often talk about how important it is to just write what the capability is that you need instead of trying to ask for a specific resource. And I think this was an example of that, right? We had asked for some resources originally, and I'll say we asked for the comfort, right? To bring the comfort in. And that's a great resource that we've asked for in every exercise that I've ever done. But the comfort is designed for trauma, and it wasn't necessarily designed for a pandemic. And while it did provide some support, it wasn't necessarily the perfect tool to meet the need, but it was a tool to meet the need. But through our conversations and really defining what my requirements were, then General Hall and Colonel Aiello were able to craft a solution that actually met our need. And they're the ones that came up with the idea of transferring medical personnel from alternate care sites directly into the hospitals instead of me asking for a very specific resource. And I think that kind of communication is really important.
And, so you mentioned earlier about how key it was to develop the relationships early on, develop those, and that helped when you got to this point of them saying, this is the problem. And then they helped with the solution as a combination of all of them. And how did you see how FEMA played a role in this? Because, you didn't just go right to DOD and say, come on down.
Almost.
Almost, I know.
But that's a really good point too. And I mean, I guess there was a point where I do have a lot of established relationships. And so it certainly was an advantage for me of knowing the right people to call. But I obviously worked very closely with my state counterparts. And as we were submitting requests through the formal channels, it was really important to help explain what the request was and why. And at the same time, I was working with our FEMA regional administrator. We had a FEMA LNO assigned to New York City, working with them, as well as some conversation with FEMA headquarters to help also push it from the top down, right? And so I think in something that is growing as rapidly as COVID-19 was growing in New York City, you have to take that bottom up and top down approach at the same time. So everybody understands what the requirement is and isn't trying to take the time to decipher it on their own. And even though we did that, there was still some of that back and forth of trying to decipher, what the actual need was. But being able to do that simultaneously, I think really helped to expedite some of the resources that we brought into New York City.
Great, thank you. And for those folks, feel free to ask questions. You can ask questions here in the Q&A function here, or you can go to on Twitter, #IAEM Think Tank. We'll take questions from either way. Next, I'd like to now, we'll come back to the end with more questions. If you have questions, we'll be bouncing between all. But as we start to move forward, I'd like to move now over to General Hall. Bill, thanks for joining us, and just sort of, take from your point of view of how this whole response for COVID-19 in general, and also for New York City, how that went.
Hey, Richard, thanks for letting us participate in today's panel. I would like to, before I get into what I call my top five, the top five things that I've learned in this response and other response, highlight the contributions of a couple of my teammates. First, Ian talked about the FEMA and the regional administrator, Mr. Von Essen. I did not know Tom before this, what a character Tom is, but I would tell you, I'm truly grateful for him and his leadership and his ability to herd cats and particularly to mentor me during the response. And I would say that for those that don't know him, he is a true gem in the emergency response community. Second to Deanne, no, Deanne, you're not the reason I retired. Although I was concerned a couple times during our response that you were never going to let me leave New York City. Not that I don't love the Big Apple, but my roots are in Texas. Your leadership during the crisis was an inspiration both for your hospitals and the medical examiner's office, but more importantly for DOD. You talked about your favorite quote and the impact our folks had on your team. And I think the same was true on the impact your leadership and the leadership in the 11 hospitals that we supported had on our folks. And it was my honor to serve shoulder to shoulder with you during this crisis. Third, Kim Aiello. I called Kim America's Medical Brigade Commander during this response because, as Rich pointed out, not only did she have responsibility for FEMA Region 2, but also 1, 3, 4, and 6. Kim is definitely one of those people that I've never, ever heard her come across a problem that she could not keep a positive attitude and figure out a solution. And me and my team at Joint Task Force Civil Support were ecstatic when we learned Kim and her team were going to join us in New York for this mission. And then finally, I can't go without saying the two dual status commanders. As you heard in the introduction, I had responsibility, which was large, then got smaller, and then got larger again. But specifically, the two dual status commanders, Major General Mike Natali representing the Empire State, and then Brigadier General Wayne McKay from the Garden State. These guys did some great work threading the needle every single day on the state and federal missions and what was required of them. And quite frankly, they allowed us to operate at the speed of the problem. Let me dive into what I would say are my 5 thoughts on military civilian relationships and how we make it work on COVID-19. And I'll try to focus on the strategic and operational and let Kim talk the tactical level. First thing is the operational environment. Deanne talked about in her opening comments what we knew in my team started looking at this nationwide back in January and then started looking. But I would tell you, when I arrived at New York City on the 24th of March, it became into focus. And what we knew on the 24th versus what we knew on the 15th of April were significantly different. And so there's 3 things there I think that are important. One for DOD was setting the theater. We learned a lot about setting the theater and how to get our forces in quickly. Some of it we'd exercised before, but some of it, quite frankly, was an opportunity to excel and try new techniques to get the resources where they needed to be very quickly. The second thing was, how do we take advantage of DOD's agility and ability to provide resources quickly? Because quite frankly, as I've told people before, there's no one else that could have pulled off the movements that we were able to pull off and get those resources where they need to be. And then finally, using the information that's available in the operational environment to provide senior stakeholder decision space. As I told my team, my goal was to stay 24 to 48 hours out ahead of my boss, Lieutenant General Richardson. So when I asked for something, that she had a reasonable expectation to get it approved and get it in the pipeline to support Deanne's effort. Relationships is my second point. How do you achieve the unity of effort? Deanne talked about, the local, state, and federal level resources. I would say that one of the key lessons learned from me is in the Army, we're very hierarchical, with this person reports to this person, and that's generally how we operate. What we learned very quickly was we had to flatten that. And there was a lot of discussion laterally And, I started to go back, Deanna, on my cell phone records and see how many nights in a row we talked, because it was significant. But we are able to strategize normally about 8:30, 10 o'clock at night on who we needed to influence to make things happen, to get her the things that she needed. And those that flattening that chain of command was definitely helpful. And then daily contact. We in a crisis, we moved to a point that we've got all this formal stuff, at least in the Army, that we do, but we spend a lot of time with text messages and phone calls. And then the liaison officers, Deanne talked about that as well, as having the right people in place that could help see around corners and help with those decisions. And then finally, I throw this one in there on unity of effort, is a common operational picture. What was reaffirmed to me in an environment where decisions are made in hours and days versus days, weeks, and months is PowerPoint slides are not a good common operational picture. And you have to have something that people can see and are drawn to help inform decision. Deanne talked about the requirements. I would second that. I show this picture. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is a diagram that I drew on, I think, the 24th of March. And I sent it to my boss, General Richardson, and then on to the Northcom commander. And I think it made it into the slides. But this is what we knew and what we thought how we were going to deploy. If I showed you a picture of what we ended up doing, it looked nothing like this. But the good news is that we were able, with our liaison officers' discussion at the state and the local level, to figure out what those requirements were and how we were going to get them in place. Another thing on requirements, I would say that was important is initially we focused on beds, how many beds were required. And I am not a medical professional of any kind. I went to the Kim Aiello medical school. And so I went from somewhere from elementary education up to, I think Kim has certified me at a master's level. But what we figured out was it was staffing. Staffing was the sole metric that we had to operate on. We could provide beds, but we had limited staffing, and we had to put it in the right place at the right time to help with that. And then finally, one of the lessons learned, I know Kim's going to talk about it a little bit, is the Urban Augmentation Medical Task Force, or UMTFs, and what they were made up of. They were not designed specifically for this pandemic. They were a team designed to go anywhere and basically do anything. The good news is these Army, Navy, and Air Force professionals rolled up their sleeves and worked where they needed to work, regardless of their specialty. And I know that DoD is looking across the board at how in the future they customize them or tailor them for the response. My fourth comment is alternate care facilities. And I would tell you, this is Bill Hall's personal opinion. After working and standing up the Javits Center in coordination with the state and Kim and her team's great work, and then 2 alternate care facilities in the state of New Jersey. I'm not a big fan of alternate care facilities. I don't believe that they create a natural gathering point that's required during a crisis where an established hospital already has that in place. One of the challenges that we ran into with the 3 alternate care facilities is the unknown. If I send a patient from my hospital there, are they going to get the care that they need? The good news is they did, but Kim and her team had to work really hard to convince hospitals that, hey, they had what they needed to take care of them. And then finally on that one, again, my personal opinion, I just don't think that in most cases, the time, manpower, and resources required ultimately don't produce the output that they're established. Now, I won't say that they never work. I know that the state of Texas is running an alternate care facility in El Paso, and I believe that it's working great for them based on their situation. And then the final thing is, being the 11th Commander Joint Task Force Civil Support, the commander of that command is by far probably the most exercised commander in DoD. And one of the things that I continue to see there is, how do we do a better job of integrating local, state, and federal partners into our exercise program? And the one thing that I've come to, my opinion on that is, we have to figure out how to incentivize it, and we've not done that. Everybody wants to work together, but everybody's busy. And so, the crisis of today generally wins out to an exercise, but I think in the long term is, how can we incentivize that so that there's less time in the greet phase and more time in getting the work done. So again, Richard, thank you. I'm looking forward to participating in today's panel.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions. One that came in via Twitter from Michelle is, how did you communicate the change in the deployment maps? So when things change, how did you communicate that both up, down, and across?
Yeah, a great question. I go back to the common operational picture, and I think that there's the internal audience, DoD, and our customers, in this case, Deanne, how we did that. And so the common operational picture helped us with that. We got really good at writing sit reps, but frankly, I don't know that I ever read any of Deanne's sit reps, nor she ever read any of mine. In our cases, it was that nightly conversation of, hey, I've got 100 and some odd people coming in. We think they're going to be ready to go to Elmhurst on this day, or a text message. We're real good in DoD about writing lengthy sit reps, but there just wasn't the time to do that. And the other part of that, back to Michelle's question, is, and I go back to Tom Von Essen, and what Tom Von Essen provided is what he was seeing at his level, and then the communication with my boss and with General Richardson. I probably talked to her 5 to 7 times a day, and then General O'Shaughnessy once to twice a day, depending on where we were in that. So I would say the overarching way we communicated that was orally, in telephone calls or text messages. And as we had time, a common operational picture and emails and all that reinforced that.
Great. Thank you. That was helpful. And for folks, again, hashtag IAM Think Tank, we'll be able to take questions there. And Tom, from the question and Q&A, we'll get to that one at the end, sort of top 3 points from everybody. But General, a couple of questions on some of the points you made. You said you operated at the speed of the problem. People are used to operating at the speed of government. Those two usually don't match up. And I know that DOD's quick is usually not a mayor's quick. So how did you, when you're talking about time, especially in a crisis, definition of quick is usually very different to different people depending on where you stand. And how did you deal with some of those issues?
Yeah, so I will give an example, and I know Kim Aiello is going to talk about one of the missions they executed, which was a Time Now mission. So I want to jump into that. But what we were trying to do, and I go back to 24 to 48 hours out in front of my boss, so she wasn't surprised, and she had an opportunity to shape at her level the things that we needed. But I go back in the conversation, daily conversations Commissioner Criswell and I had, and we were talking about, what do we need to do 2 days, 3 days, 4 days from now? Probably not a whole lot further out than that, at least in the initial month. But getting her insight allowed me to go back and shape what I needed from General Richardson. The other one is, quite frankly, assuming risk. So we brought most of our forces in through Fort Dix, New Jersey. And as you talked about, getting that designated from the DoD side as a base support installation took 9 days. We didn't have 9 days. And so I think a part of that is, who are the personalities that you have available to you that can go work magic. And in my case, I sent my deputy commander, Casey Collins, to Fort Dix. And I sent him there, I think on the 21st of March. And I said, look, man, they're not going to be prepared for us, but you have to go convince them that they have to be prepared for us. And he was able to finesse that until 9 days later, they really had the authority in place that they needed to, and we were able to start flowing forces there. So I think a second part of that is, what is the risk? And you've got to be willing to take that risk so that you can make things happen at the speed of the problem.
Great. And maybe if you, this is a pretty basic question, but what's you talked about dual status command in Title 10, Title 32, just very short, if you can, the difference between the two.
Yeah, the dual status commanders concept was brought about 2010. The Northcom commander, Admiral Winnefeld at the time, saw a gap there on federal resources and state resources and how we provided unity of effort. So Admiral Winnefeld started the dual status commander program. I was fortunate enough to be in the first class of the dual status commander, but basically it is a person and a staff, a Title 32 staff, National Guard, and a Title 10 staff, active duty, that work together in order to provide that governor or a local entity in their state the resources they need. So basically, and I'll take Mike Natali as an example. So Mike had several missions he was supporting the state of New York and the city of New York on. From our perspective, we were providing medical support to Deanne's 11 hospitals and support to the examiner's office as well. So I could provide Mike resources that he could put into play, but also with his Title 32 assets, there were some missions that I could not do. And so he could do them under the Title 32 status. So basically, that dual status commander helps synchronize all of the DoD resources with what they do best and what they can do based on their authorities.
Great, thank you. Another question, and then we'll go to Colonel Aiello, and then we have a bunch more questions. So, but from Alessia, how do you combine the concept of being quick with the concept of efficacy of the decision taken in the context of, you know, the evolving unpredictability of what was going on and continues to?
Well, you're not always going to get it right. I mean, and I go back to a mistake that I made early on. We were trying to get resources into New York City and New Jersey. And I made a commitment to Deanne for some resources to a hospital that I had to pull back 4 hours later. She was not very happy with me that evening. The good news is she forgave me, but you know, it all goes back to risk. If you're not willing to take risk, you're not going to get those resources where they need to be in time. And I think Deanne would back me up, is we showed up just in time. We never missed a mark, but we didn't get there much earlier than just in time in order to provide them then. So, you know, the risk that people at each level that they have to take, and Kim again is going to talk about a mission that they ran in taking that risk. And she and I both assumed a lot of personal risk on that, because at that point, we were still working the approval authority. The good news is the approval authority came out before we moved out, but if we had waited to start until we had that approval authority, we would not have been able to provide that support.
Okay, great, thank you. And for Kevin and Tom and others, we'll get to your questions. We're just going to go now to Colonel Aiello. Kim, thank you for joining us today. And curious, you know, it is mentioned at the beginning, you're in the period of currently transitioning from the military, but we're really curious of your perspective in what you went through and what you saw during COVID-19 in New York and everywhere else you were too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's an honor to be sitting on, I say, the stage or the computer, I should say, with Ms. Criswell in General Hall, as well as really I have to put a shout out to those that really were a part of this mission, just to watch our medical personnel and non-medical really come together to support a city that really became very special to us. So I had the opportunity and honor to command the Task Force Med. What does that mean? That was a 3,000 person joint Department of Defense formation. That means it's made up of Army, Navy, and Air Force, active duty, reserve component, and IRR. So we were telling people, hey, guess what? You've just been activated. I know you haven't worn a uniform in 6 or 7 years, but you're going to come join us in New York City. So we had 32 units from 11 states, and that does not include individual deployers that we have that obviously came throughout the United States. We were notified and alerted on the 24th of March. I was in New York City by the 25th of March, so it's just about 24 hours. And that was with my advance party. So that was about 30 of us that came from 2 units, hospital centers, and then I had 4, including myself, from the staff out of Fort Bragg. And then our main body actually arrived on the 28th of March. And then we actually saw our first patient at Javits on the 31st of March, non-COVID. And then we had a change of mission by the 2nd of April, where we started seeing COVID patients. And then I should say by the 3rd, we actually had our first COVID patient. And then by 9 April, we were actually supporting in great lengths with Ms. Criswell speaks to is the city hospitals. So one thing I want to talk about is mission requested versus what was required versus what we bring. So the mission that we were told when I hit the ground is you are going to establish an alternate care facility. It will be non-COVID. You're responsible for caring for 3,000 non-COVID patients, and it's going to be a medical shelter. So they referred to it as a tier 5. We knew, though, just by listening to the news, and then Ms. Criswell, as well as we had formed some relationships and actually hosted using American College Healthcare Executives. We actually had a call that we did within the first 24 hours and had about 60 people on it from the city hospitals. And they said, if you don't become COVID, you're not going to give us what we need. So General Hall and I were speaking to that, but once again, our mission was non-COVID. So we knew the requirement was really going to be a COVID facility, tier 1. And then we also knew because of the engagements and relationship we formed with Ms. Criswell, was in placing medical personnel, whether they were going to be embedded throughout the hospital or they were going to be in extended care, which means that they would actually take on a wing of a hospital and actually run that portion of the hospital from nuts to bolts, receiving the patients, providing patient care, etc. So we knew that's what was required. But what I bring is actually trauma capability. That's what I'm bringing. So I actually brought initially 2 148-bed hospital centers. So that means 296 beds. So I have people to take care of 296 beds. But remember, my mission, I was told, was 3,000. So you can see that staffing disparity between what the need or what the request was versus what I bring. The other thing that's important to realize is, once again, I'm bringing a trauma capability, trauma surgeon, OR nurses, and we don't do as much holding within our DoD operational units because we receive a patient, we provide care, we stabilize, and we evacuate and get them out of theater. So what we had to do is really work with, and I think Ms. Criswell speaks to it very well as just General Hall, the relationships. We really had to listen because remember, we're federally supporting. So therefore, it's what does the local community need? They're the ones that have to execute it. So we listened, and through listening, we're able to identify based on what we had for a capability. And as it's coming in, so people are going to come in first, and we were able to say, I can still get this Javits set up, but I have these personnel that I know can be employed somewhere in the city. Number one, because we just hadn't received patients or we hadn't received the numbers we had anticipated. So General Hall was able to take that, meet with Ms. Criswell, and that's how we started doing duplicity of missions, where we were still setting up the Javits, receiving patients, as well as in placing people within the hospitals. So it's understanding our capabilities, our capacities, and how we flow in, and then us actually using it to provide ways that we can be utilized, because that's why I'm there. Solve complex problems and taking our capabilities and capacity and fitting it to what your need is. The other piece was the relationships are so important. So for example, we worked with ACHE, American College of Healthcare Executives to understand what the needs were by meeting with the chief executive officers, chief nursing officers, chief medical officers, but we also learned how to take care of COVID patients. So we came from a place where we hadn't been doing what New York City had been done. We didn't know what proning was. If it was not for these city hospitals to teach us, we would not have been successful as the patient care we provided as the Javits, as well as being as useful when we went into the city hospitals. So those relationships really enabled training on both sides. The other two pieces I'm going to talk to is about execution. Credentialing versus privileging. In this case, when you're bringing medical personnel in, the credentialing and the privileging has to be done. And what you have to do is it's going to be under emergency conditions, what we can do, which is pretty open. But as we start transitioning and go to non-emergent, what are the things that we should be doing? And those are discussions we had as we got into the end of May, into the beginning of June. And that's when we started then the redeployment of certain personnel because the need had decreased, as well as, emergent conditions versus non-emergent conditions. And then the other piece is integrating into the network. We had to integrate into the healthcare, the New York City hospitals, or health and hospitals. They allowed us to actually get into their medical records. So we were able to identify patients who should move over to Javits to enable them space to see the more complex patients. That wouldn't have been as successful if they didn't allow us to help them identify those patients and then actually help them move. So they allowed us to integrate into their healthcare. Then the last piece I'm going to talk to is ask, include us, and also be transparent. We are here to support. That is what our role is. And one example specifically General Hall had spoke to is evacuation of patients. I had received a call about 2300, about 11 o'clock at night. And it was, we need some patients moved from a city hospital, about 38. There was an issue with their oxygen, and these were ventilated patients. So I called General Hall. At the same time, I'm going to start working that mission. I'm not going to employ them yet, but I'm going to get everything done that I can up until the point where they're ready to go out the door. So we identified an OI officer in charge. We identified personnel. We had the PPE, the protective equipment ready to go. We had the transportation ready to go. Simultaneously, General Hall gives me the okay. Hey, Kim, I'm going to, talk to General Richardson, which he did. And he then received approval, and I am ready. As soon as I got the approval, we went out. We worked with the emergency management EMS to actually then deploy to this said private hospital, and then evacuate people all over the city and even actually outside the city. So that was, it took us about, I want to say 15 minutes to get approval. And it took us about 14 minutes to get actually ready for that mission. So we really leaned in. One other thing I'll talk real briefly is leaning in is behavioral health support for the New York City. Ms. Criswell says we have a need, and the ability for your individuals to be able to provide classes for our medical personnel because of the things that they're seeing. We're very accustomed to seeing trauma. We have certain behavioral health classes, master resiliency trainers. So we actually put a training plan together, which ended up being about 8 classes that we videotaped that the city, New York greater hospital, health and hospitals can utilize in order to educate, train, and really work on the recovery process for their medical personnel. So that's something that we weren't told we were going to have to do, but we looked at what capabilities we had internally. That was a need, and that's something that we were able to provide.
Thank you. It's always good when I unmute myself, although some people like.
I was like, I don't think he's asked a question yet, but
some people like to keep me muted. I know, Deanna, but I do think that it's some great points. Just a couple of, if you can clarify the difference between you mentioned credentialing and privileging. Could you just maybe just give the explanation?
Yes. So every healthcare provider has to be credentialed. That means that they have actually graduated from the university, had taken their medical boards, and they're credentialed to actually provide medical care. But then they get privileged to actually do a specific procedure or see a specific population. So physician assistants, for an example, may not be privileged to see under 18 age children. So they actually by law have to be credentialed and privileged. And we were able to do this with New York City health and hospitals on a digital basis. It took us about 24 to 48 hours, but that is required that that's done. The But over time, as we get to the non-emergent, what we maybe had privileged up front, you may not necessarily privilege during a non-emergent time.
Great, thank you. And we have a number of questions. We'll go to Kevin Mishka, and we'll probably go on the phone to Travis in a minute. But first, a question from Kevin, and this is for any one of you to answer, or all. Crisis demand making quick decisions with limited information and resources. How are the decision-making and resource allocation processes any different or similar specifically in COVID versus other responses? And was the risk envelope, if you will, any larger or smaller for the COVID response compared to past disasters? So anybody want to, it probably applies both to, actually probably all three are in different ways. So anybody want to take it first?
Yeah, if it's all right, I'll give it a shot. So I think the difference here is, we're used to providing responses for natural disasters. And even the case of a hurricane, they're limited duration with a few exceptions, obviously. COVID was different in that it was not limited duration. And although Deanne and her staff and DOD were working to model where we thought the peaks and valley was going to be, it was just a model. And so I think one of the challenges that we faced was once we deployed a resource, it was hard to realign that. Not impossible, but I'll share with Kim's 2 hospitals that she brought. We were very deliberate on 2 things. First of all, there was some discussion at DOD, do we need to bring the entire hospital set? And I went to General Richardson and I said, yes, ma'am, we need to forward deploy the entire hospital set, because if there's a need, we don't need to go back to Fort Bragg or Fort Hood to bring it forward. Well, we positioned it at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and left it there. And then as things got into play with the Javits Center, we were able to bring one set forward, get it set up in short order, and then the next set. So I think the calculus that was different is we had to be careful in deploying that resource and how quickly we could redeploy it. And I go back to one of my failures in making commitment to the commissioner at one of her hospitals and then having to pull that commitment back because then we had a need, and I wasn't able to fulfill her need initially. We were able, as Kim figured out how to, do 2 missions at once to put those resources over there. But I think that, unlike a hurricane, you probably got a day or 2 or maybe 3, and then those resources came available. We had, I think, the first folks that went into a hospital for Deanne was early April, and the last ones came out, I think, the 6th of June, and that's where they operated.
And Rich, I can add something to that too, from a tactical perspective. So it really is understanding your capabilities, but also your capacity. What do I have available to me now? Where's it located? What do I have in reserve? So General Hall speaks about the equipment at Fort Dix. I knew we had the equipment, but I also knew if you give me the okay to move it, here's how long it's going to take me to move it. Here's what I need to move it. Here's how long it's going to take me to set up. And here's how, so I mean, it's down to the minutes. Like you have to know from a DOD what your capabilities and capacity are, because in the end, I'm telling General Hall, who's having a discussion with Ms. Criswell or with the state or with FEMA, and I have to be able to deliver. So it's really knowing your capabilities and capacity and planning factors, as well as it's constant communication. I probably talk to General Hall 15 times a day, 20 times a day. Ms. Criswell, maybe 1 or 2 or 3, it just depended. We were talking nonstop.
Great.
Hi, Rich. And then I think from an emergency management perspective, there's a lot that is similar with decision making for this event as there is in natural disasters. And part of that is, in the beginning of a natural disaster, you are often making decisions with limited information. And you have to adjust those decisions as information comes in. And that was no different here. But I think the part that was unique about this one, and I think it was mentioned by either Kim or Bill, is that at least with the natural disaster, you knew where your end was. This one was, we didn't know how bad was going to be and when it was going to be. And so you're making these decisions with limited information, without knowing when you're going to ever get real information and how long you're going to have to operate this way. And we were literally making resource adjudication decisions day by day during those 3 weeks, which were the peak of every day, me and senior leaders having conversations with the mayor on, do I have enough PPE to get through the next 2 days? Do I have enough staff to get through the next 2 days? And it was literally at that point, and that was what was really for me so different than a natural disaster, because even though resources might take time to come in, you actually had more access to resources than we had in this one. So I think making decisions with limited information, similar, the length of having to do that, the duration of having to do that for this, very different than what I've experienced in the past.
Right. So it's the dynamic of this, and at the same time, you didn't know when it was going to end. Hurricane, ended, and time to clean up. Tornadoes, floods. Great, thank you. A few questions. I'll go to Misha, and then Lisa's question. Misha, how do you do the supply chain logistics to meet the needs of what's being requested, given that the requests which literally changing very quickly? And the second half of that is, both from a local and from perspective, but also from, Colonel Aiello on the ground and in general from where you were, that DOD, because there were all sorts of rumors, if you remember, everywhere that somebody's not ciphering the equipment, the medications, PPE from the states that you were there, that they were going somewhere else. How did you deal with all that, the supply chain logistics, and then all the other parts of this?
So I'll start answering that and then turn it over to General Hall. So first, when we come in, and General Hall had called me before he actually deployed and said, should I take equipment? He and I had the conversation. I said yes, not knowing I was going to be working with him and it was going to be my equipment he was taking. Yes, he laughs. We have what's called an ASL, authorized stockage list, and that's medical equipment and supplies that I have as part of what my mission is and what I do for Department of Defense. So I came with my own equipment and medical supplies. There's a process to request it. Our P's and D's, which we refer to as potency and dated, actually have to get the United States Army Medical Material Command, and it takes about 72 hours to get that. But I'm coming in with that. But because that wasn't requested up front, I can't use that yet. So remember, up front, when we came in, we were working in the Javits, and Health and Human Services and FEMA was the one that was actually procuring the medical supplies and medical equipment. Once I was told I could bring my medical equipment, I brought my medical supplies. So they're not coming from the local infrastructure. I also will tell you, initially, when it came to bringing medical supplies or needing medical supplies in the Javits, there wasn't a medical logistics system set up. So we actually I used to utilize my own budget out of Fort Bragg to order medical supplies back here at Fort Bragg, prime vendors that Fort Bragg deals with, so Defense DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, deals with, and that's how we procured it, because we did not want to take it from the local community. So there was a really concerted effort on where our medical supplies were coming from. General Hall, is there anything in particular you'd like to respond to that?
Yeah, Kim, I think just a couple things. I made the remark in the statement of my opening remarks about setting the theater. To go back to what Deanne talked about not knowing duration, we had some initial thoughts about how we were going to move things to the East Coast. And I initially started out with FEMA regions 1 through 4. And then as the crisis developed, we were neck down to FEMA region 2 in New York and New Jersey. But the setting the theater part was critical for DOD to have a place to send commodities so that we weren't a burden on the state or the city. And, General Richardson continued to press upon us that we are not going to take resources they need. We were also very blessed. Somebody that I did not recognize early on was the 3rd Expeditionary Sustainment Command Commander, Brigadier General James Smith, and his team. They came in and helped us set the theater and take care of all those things that Kim's team needed so that we weren't a burden. And our sole focus was providing that support, to the point of not coming with our own PPE, so that we didn't show up at a hospital and go, okay, well, now we need PPE in a situation where they already may be down that. But I would say the importance of setting the theater helped us in that there were not gaps in the agility that DoD brings. And so ventilators, I can't remember the number. I think it was like 400. I mean, overnight, 400 ventilators showed up at Fort Dix. I mean, literally overnight. The Air Force flew them in. They were there. They were pre-positioned and ready to be distributed as required. So that setting the theater for us at the strategic level helped support what Kim needed, and more importantly, help support what Deanne needed.
Great, thank you. Question from Lisa, and she thanks everybody for the great discussion. What lessons were learned in the past several months of planning and execution that's going to help in the next weeks and months as we deal with more COVID? And then a follow-up with that is, how would you leverage the relationships developed both up, down, and across in the context of vaccine distribution that we're moving into now? So, Deanne, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'd love to start with that one. And it's a great question. We did some initial hot washes throughout the summer on many of the different lines of effort that we did, right? So from my perspective, we had a couple of major muscle movements, the biggest one being not letting the hospital infrastructure collapse. Another one was not letting any New Yorker go hungry. A third one was to provide or stand up a mass hotel operation that was supporting essential workers, dedensifying congregate settings, as well as early discharges from hospitals. And then the final one was fatality management. And so I think out of all of those, and again, a lot of this conversation has been on hospital infrastructure and hospital support. I think the biggest lesson that we learned, and you heard Bill and Kim talk about this a little bit, is we spent so much time and energy standing up alternate care facilities. And when we go back and we really look at what we could handle on our peak day of the number of people that were in alternate care facilities, as well as combined with the peak day of people in hospitals across New York City, we had enough capacity to support them in the hospitals. And we have learned that the shortfall is staffing. But part of that is also being able to load balance between hospitals better. And so we've done a lot of work over the summer to make sure that we have better procedures in place to transfer patients within systems. And if we get to a point between systems, as well as expanding surge space within hospitals. I'll tell you that our limiting factor is going to continue to be staffing. And we talk daily still about what type of staffing that we're going to be able to use or be able to tap into. We've established several staffing contracts over the summer, but that pool is not finite, right? I mean, it is finite. And so it's being utilized across the country. And so it's not going to be that fix all that I think everybody would like it to be. And it's still going to be a shortfall as we go into numbers if they ever get close to what we saw earlier in the spring. But I would say even on the other kind of lines of effort, we stood those operations up so quickly that we have learned how to improve upon them, make them more efficient, and reduce the potential for fraud in some of those operations that we had. And I think that I know that we're in a much better place going into this next wave as we're seeing it right now.
And Commissioner, you raise a good point. And I think, about the alternate care facilities and the health system collapsing, but I think COVID showed us probably more than it happens in every disaster. It's never just one crisis. It's multiple crises that we're always dealing with, whether it was, the food insecurity issues, the hoteling issues of taking care of people, the fatality management. Any one of those would have been a major crisis on its own. And then each one of those all had their sub crisis to deal with that. So you're always dealing with multiple crises as you're going through that. So I think that was a great point. And General or Colonel, do you have any additional comments on, how to leverage the relationships for going forward, maybe for vaccine or whatever else?
Yeah. So here's what I would say is I had 3 lessons learned that I think were important with that is team makeup. And again, I won't get into Kim's lane on what we brought to the response versus what we needed. And I think that as they put this together and at the national level on the vaccine distribution, what's the team that's required? Customize a little bit more. And I'm sure that they've done that based on they know it's coming, where, we did not have that luxury on where we started on COVID and where we ended. Taking advantage of distributed operations. I would tell you, I've always been a big fan of distributed operations, but that pushed us to a whole nother level. I know Kim and I both, in the fact that, of a headquarters of 150 people, I only forward deployed about 30. I left the rest of them at Fort Eustis. And then I know that Kim was a mighty team of 4 in New York until she was able to move the rest of her headquarters forward. But I think that we all learned a tremendous amount on distributed operations. And as we, come out of COVID and we can get people back together, not losing that edge and ability to talk to people instantly. I mean, we use some products there at the end that I wish that I had adopted earlier on to help us in that distributed operations. And then I think finally, how do you get those players together? I talked about incentivizing exercises where the participants are more than just DOD, because that's what we do is how do you get those other people there? And that's complex. For DOD, for a soldier, airman, Marine, or sailor, we can work them 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days. But Deanne's got a budget she has to live within for her people and how she does that. And we've got to figure out how to incentivize that and take advantage of those capabilities and not go, hey, we're going to do an exercise here. You have to be this point. If you can't do that, then we don't have time for you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to a question. Travis is actually a student of one of our classes at Harvard. Travis, just open it up and you can unmute yourself and you should be allowed to speak. Go ahead, Travis. Travis, got a question? Oh, I think we had him and we lost him. Okay. Commissioner, just as we start to wind down, just as the general gave us the 3 points, what were 3 takeaways that you had from this? Oh, you're muted.
There we go. 3 takeaways that I had on this. It's interesting. I think, and I'll talk about this actually more and kind of in line with Tom's question from Chicago on there too. I think when you talk about 3 things that you can focus on as you're going through a crisis is 1, I think that you need to, as a leader, make sure that you're not getting caught up in the minutia. Right? You need to set the strategic direction. You need to provide some guidance to your team, but then you need to really let them figure it out and let them report back and set up that reporting schedule. But if you get too caught up in the details, you're never going to be able to see all of the big picture and anticipate the next thing that's going to happen. And as we've talked, things were changing from minute to minute here. And so really giving them the room to grow and run with it, I think made us more successful than trying to really focus on all of the details. And so I think that was really important. I think the second one is really around situational awareness. Getting situational awareness is by far the hardest thing on any disaster. And it was equally, if not more challenging on this. Information sharing between disciplines is always hard. Information is power, and people don't necessarily always want to give up information, but information was what was helping to drive decision. And if there ever was a disaster that you could say needed data to drive decisions, it was this response right here. And so trying to get that situational awareness and get that reported out in a way that leaders could make decisions was really important. And I think the part of that that's important is you can't understaff that function. You need to build a really strong situational awareness unit that understands the importance of getting data and analyzing it. And, as I've always said to my National IMAT team, doing the what, so what, now what behind the information is incredibly important and really actually helps you maintain a positive attitude throughout the response. And I think the final thing is taking care of your staff. We worked really long hours. It wasn't one of those disasters that required necessarily 24-hour operations from our EOC. So people ended up just working extremely long hours. And so we've done a lot of work on trying to establish what that workflow, that work balance will be as we go into wave 2, but then also understanding what their needs are. And one of the things that we had done, Kim had talked about setting up this combat stress support for our hospitals, but we did not necessarily combat stress, but we brought in mental health support for my team. And we brought in a mental health professional that was available at any time of day for people to call. And so they would reach out to this individual initially in person, eventually virtual. We would do webinars. They could do one-on-one meetings. And we were able to get reports from them to understand the trends of things people were concerned about, so we could actually take proactive measures to try to address some of those concerns. Because if one person's hearing it or feeling it, then we might have others. And so taking care of your staff, and I think adding that piece for us and having that mental health professional was really important. Did it fix everything? No, I mean, it was a really trying response for everybody, myself included. But relying on each other and knowing that we each had each other's backs, I think made a big difference.
Great. And before we come to you, Kim, another question is for anybody, what were the challenges associated with determining when it was the time to begin demobilizing? And what were the operational and, dare I say, political considerations that had to be addressed? In all three, you have this huge smile on your face.
Well, I'll start off on that. It was really interesting when we got to the point of demobilization. There's three sides to every story. My side, someone else's side, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. But it really got down to a point in the great working relationship. We had some meetings that were I would call a little tense at times. But it took us getting together, as Deanne said, every day and then every couple days to get a better understanding of what ground truth was, because I won't even go into the political point. I think that that's kind of self-evident, but the pressures of, is there enough capability at a hospital? In this case, can we redistribute capability? From the DoD perspective, we weren't sure where the next hotspot was going to be as we saw the curve start to go down. And so we needed some time to reset that, balanced with Deanne's people that needed some more downtime, quite frankly, for all that they've been through. And then how did we do that? And of course, great Americans that on both sides that served during this, that didn't want to leave the fight. They wanted to stay and fight. And so Kim had the challenge of going, hey, we know you want to be here, but we need you to reset. So if we have to move you somewhere else. But I think that face-to-face coordination that we were able to do and get ground truth of what the team still were doing, or if there were a time to start demobbing them. And then the demobilization process was a little bit of a challenge because policy wasn't clear. People didn't know for sure what the requirements were going to be to demob, because what Kim and I's fear was, we go back to the great pandemic. We didn't want to spread COVID throughout the entire United States, because she had people from almost every state and territory on her teams and take that back to their home location. So that was a challenge as well.
A quick question that just came in from Adam. It was my observation in Washington, D.C. that hospitals were hesitant to release their patients to other facilities. He suspects it was due to the loss of income, however, was not to verify that one way or another. Was that an issue at all that you saw in New York? I see Kim shaking her head.
I can talk a little bit to that. What we found when we worked with the city hospitals, it wasn't that they didn't want to release, they were purely exhausted. And it's a process to release a patient, and there's requirements that go in releasing a patient. So that's why we started the LNOs, had access to their medical system, and said, here are the ones that, so we kind of did the homework for them to enable the release. So, and we found that because we went into the hospitals and said, why aren't we getting patients? I think the first day we had 13. They said, we're exhausted. We don't have the time to even work through releasing them. So that's what we found in our experience.
Great.
And I would just add on that a little bit, Rich, too. I think it was, we talked a lot in the beginning about setting the requirements, and initially it was non-COVID, and then it went to COVID, but there was a long list of exclusion factors too, right? And I think to Kim's point, the hospitals were so tired that they didn't actually have the time to go through this list of exclusion factors of why they couldn't send somebody there. And the success was when we ended up putting Kim's staff into the hospitals to really figure out who was the right fit and then move them over there. And that's how we made it successful. But through that process was really when we determined we should just be moving medical personnel into the hospitals.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question on Twitter is, you talked about additional hazards. Were there concerns related to ventilations in buildings during COVID, whether it be at the Javits or other places? Because everybody kept talking about ventilation and circulation and things. Did that come up as an issue at all?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with that just generally. I mean, that there was a lot that was learned along the way, right? From what we knew in January is very different than what we know today. And the guidance was continuously being updated as scientists learned more about how the virus was spread. And so ventilation was one of those subjects that came up often. And we just engaged with our health department. So our local health department and state health were on top of that and providing the guidance in the direction that we needed for any type of facility that was having concerns or had questions regarding ventilation or anything else about how it could spread.
Great, thank you. And now we'll come to Colonel Aiello for your 3 points, lessons learned here.
So I think the first thing, and I have many, but the 3 nailed it down to 3, is that one thing we always said is we're in this together. And that was what New York City had said. That's what Javits had said. It was a big sign that was up, and it truly was, we're in this together. We understood that we federally are supporting what the requirement is. We are not in the lead, and it's really knowing your place is so important. But we also learned who our partners were. So I knew who the task force commander was in each of the regions I was in. Who's the dual status commander? Who's the city commissioner? Who's working the alternate care facility or in the hospital? So it's learning your partners and learning their vantage point. What's important to them? What are their needs? Because then that's what I'm there to help solve those problems and take my small capability and employ them. So I have to learn. And different people had different needs. Different cities had different needs, as well as the use of, as part of the We're in This Together, is the use of liaison officers, putting LNOs. So for an example, in Massachusetts, I had an LNO with the task force commander, the dual status commander, someone at the Boston Convention Center, and someone in Tewksbury. Those were just liaison officers that were by their side. So the DOD wasn't DOD, it was Kim, it was Rich, it was a name, and it became a relationship. And I think that helped us in terms of we're in this together. The next thing is plan out. Capabilities, vice capacity, vice the requirements, vice the risk. I lived and breathed that. I always knew what I had when, because of the great staff and individuals that I worked with. But also we were, I'll use this as a kind of the exit strategy. And I know we spoke a little bit about that, but that was important because I will tell you, 531st is redeployed right now doing COVID care. So if we didn't have the ability to bring them home and allow them to reset, they probably wouldn't be able to do the work that they're doing on the West Coast right now. As well as we had those that are reserve component and individual ready reserves that are pulled out of community hospitals. They're coming out of Boston, they're coming out of Chicago, some came out of New York City. So, the ability to say, hey, as we're seeing that the need is less here, let's start redeploying as we can. And that was a conversation with Ms. Criswell. She was so great to work with us and wasn't like, you will stay until this day. So we actually did a waterfall. We started redeploying individuals as the need was no longer there. So we also didn't redeploy as units. We redeployed as people to enable them to get back into their communities, as well as get back into the units to reset. Because once again, some are redeployed today. And the last peak that Ms. Criswell talked to is take care of your people. We were a 24/7 operation. I had a requirement to report hourly. General Hall had a requirement to report hourly. But what we did utilize was our behavioral health, our chaplain, and then about a month in, I was very adamant that everyone has to have a day off. So when it came to staffing, and I was telling General Hall what I could staff, I always had in that the nursing staff needed a day off, because in Javits in particular, they would be wearing PPE 12 to 15 hours. It's not where you walk in and you're walking into a room. You walk into the Javits Center where all the patients are, and they were immediately gowned up. So really take care of your people. And I will tell you in the end, and 2 more points, is we had a 0.03% COVID positive rate for our task force. That is extremely, extremely low, because we took it real serious about the PPE, making sure that as soon as we could, we bedded people down and they were eating well. And the last piece I'll kind of leave with is to give grace. We are going to make errors, and we're going to mess things up. And I can tell you one, we messed up. I messed up COVID tests. I lost hundreds of them. Not purposefully, but that happened. And thankfully, grace was given to me because I had 24 hours to redo it all. But if I had just been fired on the spot, probably a fourth of my formation and all of us would have been fired, because there's things that we got wrong, but we learned from it. We after action reviewed, we shared, and then we had another solution to move forward.
Great, thank you. And just to follow up on one last point with the commissioners, you mentioned how, taking care of the people and the mental health aspects was essential. And that was all, certainly at your level, was more trending reporting, not about specifics. You didn't get into it. You didn't know individuals had specific issues and things.
Absolutely. It was just trends, right? And being able to see trends of the types of things people are asking, I think, is really valuable information. Everything was personally confidential. Absolutely.
Great. And so, well, any last comments? I think it was a great, think tank, great conversation. Any last closing comments that you haven't mentioned already? I took lots of notes. I know everybody else has, just by a lot of the comments that I'm getting in all the different aspects. Any closing comments?
I'll just start with just saying thank you. This was an incredible experience, without a doubt. And I am so appreciative for the support that I had from both Bill and Kim, as well as all of the other people that came to New York City to help. It was a trying time for many weeks, and we are eternally grateful for all the assistance that we've been able to get.
Okay, great. And to quote one of the comments here, thank you for the generosity and frankness of your sharing. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. It was great. Look forward to talking to you all again soon.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody that participated. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.